Tobias was 67 when he first noticed something was wrong. He'd been sitting in his armchair one evening, reading the paper, when a sudden cramp shot up his calf like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't the first time, but this one lingered, tight, unyielding, almost angry. He rubbed his leg, thinking it was just old age catching up, but deep down, he knew something was different. The next morning, while climbing the stairs to his bedroom, he felt a strange tingling in his toes, as if they were waking up from a deep sleep they never should have fallen into. That's when he decided to see me. When Tobias came into my office, his voice carried that quiet mix of worry and embarrassment I've heard so many times in my years as a doctor. He had managed his type 2 diabetes for over a decade, but lately his energy had been slipping. Meals left him drowsy, his hands sometimes trembled when he tried to button his shirt, and his hair, once thick and silver, was thinning faster than he cared to admit. The cramps were becoming nightly visitors, and the numbers on his glucose meter seemed to mock every bit of effort he put into his diet. "I'm doing everything I'm told," he said, "and it still feels like I'm losing pieces of myself." I told Tobias what I tell my own family. Sometimes it's not just about what we remove from our plates, but what we add. The right foods don't just keep blood sugar stable, they quietly rebuild the damage diabetes causes day after day. His eyes narrowed a little, curious, like a man hearing a whisper in a language he almost understands. So I painted the picture for him: food that could soothe his nerves like warm hands on a cold winter night, that could ease his cramps before they even began, that could strengthen his heart and kidneys without the harsh edge of medicine. And most importantly, food he could enjoy, not just endure. I remember his laugh when I mentioned the first one, quinoa. "You mean that fancy stuff my granddaughter eats in her salad?" he said. But when I explained how its magnesium could calm the restless storm in his muscles, how its amino acids could help his nerves rebuild themselves, how it could steady his blood sugar like a hand on the shoulder, his smile faded into thoughtfulness. Then we talked about soybeans, not the processed powders, but the whole, warm, nourishing kind, rich enough in protein to rebuild strength and gentle enough to protect his kidneys. And finally, pumpkin seeds, those tiny green gems that, in the right amount, could work quietly through the night to relax his muscles, support his heart, and even bring back some of that shine to his hair. Tobias didn't change everything overnight, but he began, one small step at a time. A spoonful of quinoa at lunch, a handful of pumpkin seeds in the afternoon instead of cookies, a warm bowl of soybeans tossed with garlic and lemon at dinner. Slowly, he noticed his legs didn't lock up so fiercely at night. The tingling in his toes grew less insistent. His energy didn't crash mid-afternoon, and he found himself walking a little farther each day without thinking about it. The most surprising thing, he told me weeks later, was how much lighter he felt, not just in his body, but in his mind. As I watched him leave my office that day, shoulders straighter than when he came in, I thought about how healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the form of simple, quiet foods, seeds and beans and grains that know how to repair what life and illness have worn down. Tobias learned that the real medicine for diabetes doesn't always come from a bottle. Sometimes it's in the small choices, repeated every day, that allow the body to remember how to heal. It was past midnight when Tobias found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, rubbing his calves with both hands. The muscles felt tight, almost knotted, and the cramp had crept up so suddenly that it startled him awake. He glanced at the glowing digits on the clock, 12:43 a.m., and sighed. He didn't want to wake his wife Maria, so he tiptoed into the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would help. But as he leaned on the counter, he noticed something else, a faint tingling in his toes, almost as if they were buzzing under the skin. It wasn't the first time, but tonight it felt stronger, and it left him with a sinking thought he didn't want to entertain. Something's getting worse. In the morning, Maria saw the dark circles under his eyes and asked what was wrong. Tobias shrugged it off at first, the way people do when they're trying not to worry the ones they love. But Maria had known him for over 40 years. She could read the truth in the way his shoulders sagged. "You haven't been sleeping well for weeks," she said softly. He didn't argue. He simply poured his coffee and stared out the window, watching the street beyond their garden, remembering how just a few years ago he could walk the whole block without stopping to catch his breath. When Tobias finally mentioned the cramps and the strange tingling, I could see the concern in Maria's eyes. She had heard enough stories from friends about diabetic complications, neuropathy, circulation problems, kidney strain. They had both tried to keep his type 2 diabetes in check, but Tobias admitted that even with careful eating, his numbers were creeping higher and his energy felt like it was leaking out of him day by day. He wasn't looking for a lecture, he wanted hope, something practical, something human. I told Tobias what many people with diabetes don't hear enough. Your food can be more than just safe for blood sugar, it can be medicine for the damage you can't see. His eyebrows lifted at that. Medicine? He asked, like I'd just offered him a secret. Yes, I said, but not the kind in bottles. I'm talking about foods that can actually help your nerves recover, calm your muscles, protect your kidneys, and still keep your glucose steady. I could see Maria glance at him, a tiny smile breaking through the worry. Maybe this was the beginning of a different kind of conversation. That's when I told him about the first one, quinoa. Not as a trendy health fad, but as a quiet, steady worker inside the body. I explained how its magnesium content could help relax his calf muscles before they seized in the night, how its amino acids could help his nerves rebuild their protective coating, and how its slow-burning carbohydrates could keep his blood sugar from spiking and crashing. It's not about eating a mountain of it, I said, just the right portion, prepared well, a few times a week. Tobias leaned back in his chair, picturing it, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the tightness in his face soften. That night, Maria cooked quinoa for the first time in their marriage. She mixed it with spinach, garlic, and a squeeze of lemon, just like I'd suggested. Tobias was cautious. He had learned to be suspicious of new foods. But after the first bite, he smiled. It was warm, nutty, and satisfying in a way he hadn't expected. As they cleared the table, Maria teased, "If this keeps you from kicking me in your sleep, I'll make it every night." They both laughed, and in that moment, the cramps and the fatigue felt just a little less heavy. Tobias didn't know it yet, but he had just taken the first small step in a much bigger journey. A week after Tobias started adding quinoa to his meals, something unexpected happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the house felt too quiet and the minutes seemed to stretch. Usually, around 3 o'clock, Tobias would sink into his recliner, drowsy and drained, his blood sugar slipping just enough to make his eyelids heavy. Maria often found him there, half asleep with the television murmuring in the background. But today was different. 3 o'clock came and went, and Tobias was still in the kitchen, washing dishes and humming an old tune. Maria noticed. "No nap today?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Tobias shrugged, but there was a glint in his eyes he hadn't had in a while. "Don't feel like I need one," he said. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gotten through an afternoon without that heavy, sluggish feeling pressing down on him. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't suddenly feel 20 years younger, but the fog that usually settled over him at this hour just wasn't there. When Tobias came for his follow-up, I asked how he'd been feeling. He told me about the afternoons, about feeling steadier, about how his legs didn't cramp as often at night. I explained something he hadn't realized. By adding quinoa, he wasn't just giving his body fuel, he was slowing the whole blood sugar roller coaster that had been wearing him down for years. Stable glucose meant less inflammation, steadier energy, and fewer of those small crashes that chip away at your mood and stamina. I could see him absorbing the idea that food wasn't just about avoiding harm, it was about actively building strength. That day, I introduced him to another quiet ally, soybeans. Not the pale, processed kind that show up in snack bars or protein powders, but the whole, warm, tender ones that have been nourishing people for centuries. I told him about the way their plant-based protein could help keep his muscles strong without putting extra strain on his kidneys, and how their low glycemic index meant they would release sugar into his bloodstream so slowly that his body hardly noticed. "They're not just good for you," I said, "they work with you." Maria decided to make them part of dinner that night. She boiled fresh edamame, tossed them in lemon juice and olive oil, and sprinkled them with chopped garlic. Tobias popped the first one from its shell and was surprised at the earthy sweetness. They ended up eating the whole bowl while talking about the neighbor's new dog, not even realizing they'd skipped dessert. Later that night, when Tobias climbed into bed, he realized something else. His legs felt calm, his stomach felt settled, and for the first time in a long time, he thought he might actually sleep through till morning. It wasn't a miracle, it was a small change, a single meal, a gentle shift. But for Tobias, it felt like hope, the quiet, steady kind that doesn't shout, but stays with you when the lights are off and the world is quiet. He was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could turn this around. It was early Saturday when Tobias woke to the sound of birds in the garden. The first thing he noticed wasn't the sunlight or the cool air drifting in through the window. It was the absence of pain. For months, he'd grown used to the dull ache in his calves that greeted him before his feet even touched the floor. But this morning, his legs felt normal. He lay there for a moment, afraid to move, as if shifting would wake the discomfort again. When he finally swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, he felt steady, balanced. Maria saw the change before he said a word. "You're walking like you've won the lottery," she teased, pouring coffee into his favorite mug. Tobias grinned. "Feels like I did," he said, stretching his legs out under the table. He didn't know if it was the quinoa, the soybeans, or simply the feeling of taking back some control. But something inside him was loosening, not just the muscles, but the worry that had been coiled tight for years. When Tobias came for his next check-in, I listened as he described the morning. I told him that magnesium-rich foods like quinoa and pumpkin seeds can help relax muscles and improve circulation, making those first steps of the day less of a battle. I reminded him that circulation isn't just about the heart, it's about every small blood vessel delivering oxygen and nutrients to tissues that need them. When those vessels relax, the whole body breathes easier. That was the moment I told him about the third piece of his puzzle, pumpkin seeds. They look small, I said, but they're packed with the kind of minerals your body's been begging for. Magnesium to calm your muscles, zinc to help your nerves, and healthy fats to keep your heart strong. I could see him picturing them, skeptical at first, until I mentioned how a handful in the afternoon could replace the salty chips he sometimes reached for. That afternoon, Maria toasted a small pan of raw pumpkin seeds until they popped gently in the skillet, then tossed them over a fresh spinach salad with lemon and olive oil. Tobias ate slowly, savoring the crunch. Later that evening, as they watched an old film together, he realized his legs hadn't twitched once. It was such a small victory, but he felt it deeply. In the quiet before bed, Maria rested her hand on his arm and said, "You seem lighter lately, not just in your body, but in here." She tapped her chest. Tobias thought about it for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "maybe I'm just starting to believe I can still change things." And for the first time in years, he climbed into bed without bracing himself for the ache that usually waited there. A month had passed since Tobias first sat in my office, rubbing his calves and talking about sleepless nights. It was a bright, breezy afternoon when Maria suggested something she hadn't in years. "Let's walk around the block." She said it casually, as if it were no big thing, but they both knew the truth. For the past couple of years, even the thought of that walk had made Tobias hesitate. His legs would tire halfway, his breath would shorten, and the ache in his feet would nag at him all the way home. But today, he felt different. Steady, curious to see what his body could do. They started slow, the gravel crunching under their shoes. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. Tobias noticed things he hadn't paid attention to in ages, the laughter of children playing in a yard, the way the sunlight dappled across the cracked pavement. Halfway around, he realized something startling. His legs weren't protesting. The tightness in his calves was absent, and there was a lightness in his step that surprised him. When they made it back to the front gate, Maria looked at him with a mixture of pride and relief. "You didn't stop once," she said. Tobias smiled, but inside he felt something bigger. Proof that the small changes he'd been making were adding up to something real. He wasn't just eating differently, his body was responding, repairing itself in quiet, determined ways. At his next visit, I explained what was happening beneath the surface. The combination of steady blood sugar, improved circulation, and anti-inflammatory nutrients from those plant-based foods was giving his muscles more oxygen and energy to work with. His nerves were calming, his heart was under less strain, and his kidneys were being spared the constant overload that uncontrolled blood sugar can bring. "It's not magic," I told him. "It's your body finally getting what it's needed all along." That evening, Maria tried a new recipe, quinoa mixed with roasted vegetables, a sprinkle of pumpkin seeds, and a side of steamed edamame. Tobias ate without rushing, tasting each bite. "Feels like my plate's working harder than my medicine ever did," he said. Maria laughed, but she knew he meant it. The walk that day had changed something in him, not just his body, but his belief that improvement was still possible at his age. Before bed, Tobias looked at his shoes by the door and thought, maybe tomorrow we'll go around twice. 2 weeks after that walk, Tobias and Maria hosted Sunday dinner for their children and grandchildren. It had been a long time since Tobias had felt confident enough to take on a full evening like that. In the past, family gatherings left him tired before dessert, his legs aching under the table, his mind foggy from the food, his patience worn thin. But this time, Maria noticed something different from the start. He moved easily between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying dishes without the subtle wince she'd grown used to seeing. The table was set with roast chicken, a colorful quinoa salad, a warm bowl of soybeans tossed with garlic and lemon, and a small dish of pumpkin seeds sprinkled over fresh greens. When his eldest granddaughter asked about the seeds, Tobias smiled and told her they were his secret weapon. The kids giggled, and Maria rolled her eyes affectionately. But as the meal went on, Tobias found himself telling the story, how a few small foods had begun to change his days. He didn't lecture, didn't preach. He simply shared how the cramps had eased, how his afternoons no longer disappeared into naps, how he'd walked around the block without stopping. He told them he felt like his body was remembering something it had forgotten, how to feel steady, how to recover. His son, who had been quietly watching him, said, "Dad, you look different, healthier." And Tobias realized he hadn't heard those words in years. After dinner, instead of sinking into his armchair, Tobias joined the kids outside. They kicked a ball back and forth, nothing too strenuous, but enough to make Maria pause in the doorway, smiling. She saw a glimpse of the man she'd known decades ago, the one who would chase the children through the yard without checking his watch for his next pill. Later that night, Tobias sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about the day. He felt tired, yes, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from moving, laughing, living. He thought about how, just a few months ago, he'd been quietly resigning himself to a smaller and smaller life. Now, the horizon felt a little wider. He didn't know exactly where this road would take him, but he knew one thing: he was moving forward again. It was a rainy Thursday morning when Tobias sat by the living room window, watching the drops slide down the glass. The world felt hushed, softened, the kind of day that invites reflection. Maria was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast, quinoa simmering on the stove, the faint aroma of garlic drifting into the room. Tobias rested his hands on his knees and realized something so simple yet so powerful. He felt at peace in his body, not perfect, not young again, but steady and grateful. He thought back to the nights of restless legs, the mornings when pain greeted him before the sunlight did. He remembered the frustration of doing everything right and still feeling worse with each passing month. Those days weren't so far behind him, but they already felt like another life. Now, his energy had a quiet consistency. The cramps were rare, his feet were less numb, and he could walk the block without bracing for the ache. Even his hair seemed to be holding on a little better, with a healthy sheen Maria swore she could see. When he came for his next visit, I noticed it right away, the subtle ease in the way he sat down, the light in his eyes. He told me he'd been sleeping through most nights, that his afternoons were no longer lost to exhaustion. "I'm not cured," he said, "but I'm living again." I reminded him that this wasn't luck, it was the result of small, steady choices made day after day, the kind that allow the body to repair itself in ways medicine alone can't. That evening, Tobias and Maria took their walk in the drizzle, the scent of wet earth rising from the ground. The world was quiet, just the sound of their footsteps and the occasional splash through a puddle. As they rounded the last corner toward home, Maria slipped her arm through his and said, "You've changed, you know." Tobias smiled, not because he needed the reminder, but because he felt it too. In his legs, in his breath, in the way hope no longer felt like something far away. Back at the house, he sat down to dinner, a warm plate of quinoa with vegetables, a side of soybeans, and a sprinkle of pumpkin seeds. Simple, unassuming foods, the kind that don't demand attention, but give back more than you expect. Tobias took a bite, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows he's doing something right for himself. Outside, the rain eased, and a pale beam of light broke through the clouds. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. A reminder that change doesn't have to be loud to be real. In that moment, Tobias realized something he wished he could tell every person battling the slow wear of diabetes. The smallest things, a handful of seeds, a cup of grains, a bowl of beans, can hold the power to change the way you move through the world. One meal at a time, one day at a time, you can give your body the chance to remember how to heal. And that, he thought, is the kind of victory worth keeping. A few weeks later, Tobias sat at his desk with a pen in his hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the garden. He had been thinking about his grandson, Daniel, who had just turned 18 and was heading off to university. Daniel didn't have diabetes, but Tobias knew how quickly life could change with the wrong habits, the wrong food, the wrong pace. He began writing, slowly at first, the words coming in uneven bursts. "Daniel," he wrote, "when you're young, you think your body will always work the way it does now. You believe you can run, eat, and live without limits. I used to think that too. But life will teach you that your health is like a garden. You have to tend it every day, or it will overgrow with weeds you never saw coming." As he wrote, Tobias found himself telling Daniel about the changes he'd made, not in the language of medicine, but in the language of living. How the cramps that once woke him at night were now rare visitors, how the numbness in his toes had faded, how his walks around the block felt like reclaiming little pieces of his old self. He described the simple foods, quinoa, soybeans, pumpkin seeds, not as magic cures, but as steady companions that gave his body what it needed to heal quietly in the background. By the time he set the pen down, Tobias realized the letter wasn't just for Daniel, it was for himself. A record of the road he'd taken back from the edge, proof that change was possible even when you've lived with the same condition for years. He folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it on the mantel where Maria could see it. That night, as they sat together on the porch, Maria asked what he'd been writing. Tobias just smiled and said, "A little reminder for him and for me that it's never too late to start living better." They sat in comfortable silence, the crickets singing in the distance, and Tobias thought about how far he'd come, not just in his health, but in the way he saw his life. It wasn't about avoiding illness anymore. It was about choosing every day the small things that made the rest of life feel worth living. It was a gray Monday morning when Tobias returned to the clinic for a routine checkup. The rain had left the sidewalk slick, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves. In the waiting room, he noticed a man sitting alone by the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked about Tobias's age, perhaps a little younger, but there was a heaviness in his posture, the kind Tobias knew all too well. Their eyes met briefly, and the man offered a polite nod. Tobias nodded back, then glanced at the glucose meter peeking from the man's jacket pocket. Something about it pulled him closer. "First time here?" Tobias asked, settling into the chair beside him. The man hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, doctor says I've got type 2. I've been reading online, and honestly, I don't even know where to start." His voice was low, almost apologetic, like he was confessing something. Tobias felt a quiet echo of his own first visit, the fear, the confusion, the silent question of, is this the beginning of the end? He didn't launch into advice. Instead, he told a piece of his story, the restless nights, the cramps, the slow decline that felt impossible to stop. Then he spoke of the first small change he made, the quiet foods that began to work on his body from the inside out. He described how it wasn't about chasing miracles, but about feeding the body what it had been missing for years. The man listened, his shoulders easing just a little. "So you're saying it's possible to feel better?" he asked. Tobias smiled. "I'm saying it's possible to live better, and when you do that, the rest starts to follow." When Tobias's name was called, he stood and shook the man's hand. "Start small," he said, "and give yourself the chance to be surprised." As he walked toward the exam room, he felt a quiet pride, not just for the progress he'd made, but for being able to hand someone else the hope that had once been handed to him. Later, as he and Maria walked home under a patchwork sky of clouds and sunlight, Tobias thought about how far he'd come. The road hadn't been fast, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And now, he wasn't just walking it for himself. He was walking it for everyone who needed to see that even in the later chapters of life, change was still possible, and healing was still worth chasing. Spring came quietly that year, almost shy after the long winter rains. Tobias woke early one morning to the sound of doves cooing somewhere beyond the garden wall. Maria was still asleep, so he slipped into his sweater and stepped outside. The air was cool, damp with dew, and the soil smelled alive again. He walked slowly between the rows of flowers and herbs, stopping at a small patch near the fence. Last autumn, Maria had tucked a few seeds into the earth, quinoa, soybeans, and pumpkin, just to see what would happen. Now green shoots were pushing their way toward the light, stubborn and steady. Tobias crouched down and ran his fingers lightly over the leaves, feeling a quiet kinship with them. They had been given the right care, the right conditions, and now they were doing what they were meant to do: grow. As the sun inched higher, Tobias thought about the months behind him. The nights of calm sleep, the walks that had grown longer and easier, the dinners that nourished without leaving him drained. He realized that his life had shifted in ways so subtle, he might have missed them if he hadn't stopped to look back. And just like the plants in the soil, his own roots felt stronger now, anchored by small, consistent choices. Maria joined him in the garden, wrapping a scarf around her shoulders. "They're coming along," she said, nodding at the sprouts. Tobias smiled. "So are we." They stood together in the morning light, listening to the soft hum of the world waking up. And for the first time in years, Tobias felt not just hopeful, but certain that the rest of his life could be lived with energy, peace, and purpose. It wasn't a grand ending. There was no applause, no fireworks, just the steady rhythm of days built on better choices. But Tobias knew that was enough. Sometimes the quiet victories are the ones that last the longest. If you've been listening to Tobias's story, maybe you've recognized a piece of yourself in him. The sleepless nights, the tired afternoons, the quiet worry that your best days might be behind you. I've seen that look in many faces over the years, and I can tell you this: it's never too late to take back ground you thought you'd lost. Tobias didn't get here by chasing miracles or overhauling his life overnight. He started small, a spoonful of quinoa in place of white rice, a warm bowl of soybeans instead of a heavy dinner, a handful of pumpkin seeds where once there was a bag of chips. Simple, unremarkable choices until they began to change everything. That's the truth I want you to take with you. Real healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly under the surface until one morning you realize you've walked farther, slept better, felt lighter than you have in years. And that change began with something so small it almost didn't seem worth mentioning until it was. So wherever you are in your journey, start with one thing, just one. Let your body feel the difference, and let that difference give you the courage to take the next step. Tobias did, and if his story tells us anything, it's this: hope isn't just for the lucky, it's for the willing. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me the one small change you're ready to make this week. Let's see how far it can take you. When Tobias first walked into my office, his days were measured by discomfort. Nights broken by cramps, mornings dulled by fatigue, afternoons lost to exhaustion. His world had grown smaller without him even realizing it, until the walls of his life felt close and unyielding. But through a handful of simple, deliberate changes, Tobias began to reclaim that space. He didn't find a miracle cure. What he found was steadiness. The cramps that once startled him awake now come rarely, if at all. His walks have grown longer, his afternoons lighter, his energy more reliable. Meals have become moments of nourishment, not just fuel. And perhaps most importantly, his outlook has shifted from resignation to quiet determination. What I want you to see in Tobias's story is not just his improvement, but the way it began, not with perfection, not with an overwhelming overhaul, but with a single choice, repeated, and then another and another, until his body began to remember how to heal. So as you close this video, I invite you to take a moment and reflect. Where in your own life could one small, intentional change make a difference? Maybe it's the food on your plate. Maybe it's a short walk each morning. Maybe it's the decision to believe your best days are not behind you. The truth is, transformation rarely happens in a rush. It's built slowly, in the quiet moments when you choose what will truly serve you. And when you do, those small victories will begin to stack until one day you look back and realize you've built a life that feels lighter, fuller, and worth protecting. Because no matter where you're starting, there is always room to grow, to heal, and to hope. And that hope, once planted, can carry you farther than you ever imagined.